Have you heard about this movie on Netflix called 365 Days? Or I guess it's 365 DNI in its original Polish? Yeah. So, so I saw an article earlier this week that this movie had been trending on Netflix and that it was supposedly the Polish version of 50 Shades of Grey, and that it's an erotic thriller with a problematic premise that's based on a trilogy of books. And, I like trashy erotic thriller type movies, so why not? I have Netflix, might as well just, no harm in watching it. So I did, and apparently, there's been like TikTok challenges of people recording their reactions during this like 4 minute long sex sequence on a boat and everything, so it's been like a trending thing, so, I figured I'd check it out. I mean, what else am I doing? I mean, I am making my way through many other Vinegar Syndrome movies I just bought, but sure, let's take a brief period to watch this movie. So, let's start with the plot. The plot involves a Sicilian gangster named Massimo, and one day he's doing a business deal with his father, who's the head of the cartel or mob gang or whatever they are, and he sees a beautiful woman on the beach. And because of this, he's sort of distracted, and his father's assassinated, and he also takes the bullet. 5 years go by, and he happens to see this woman when he's coming back from a business trip at the airport, and he decides to kidnap her. Yeah, and he creates sort of a weird rule, and that is he's gonna hold on to her for a whole year. He kidnaps her on her 29th birthday, and if she doesn't fall in love with him or want to fuck him in a year, he'll let her go. So let's start there. So the actor who plays Massimo, let's say he is a very tan, muscular, tall, greased black hair. He is the kind of exotic thing that would be fetishized in a romance novel. So he is the pinnacle of that. You're either going to think he looks like Hasif Manvi from Patriot Act, or you're going to think he's a really hot dude if you're in this movie's intended demographic, which I assume is women between the ages of, let's say, 29 and 60. Just guessing. So that's him. If this movie were about someone who looks like me, or like some other sort of like, pasty incel kidnapping a woman in his basement and holding on to her for a year, it's a much different movie. That is a serial killer movie, which can also be found on Netflix, probably. But fine. Just like 50 Shades was about a really abusive relationship, this is also about an abusive relationship. But this movie, I want to say this movie handles it somewhat better. Well, let's do this. So, the woman in this, her name is Laura. And I should say, this is a Polish movie. The character of Laura is Polish. So this is about a romance between a Sicilian and a Polish woman. Most of the movie is spoken in English, because the Italian characters don't speak Polish and the Polish characters don't speak Italian. I also assume it's because if they're trying to market this movie internationally, it's a lot easier to find people who do subtitles for English language stuff into your home language, because American movies obviously go out a lot of places, as opposed to, I think the last Polish movie I saw was Cold War, which was Oscar nominated for Best Director. This is a much different Polish film. Laura, she seems to work in like the hotel industry. The movie doesn't make it quite clear what she does, but she's high up in some in the hotel industry. And when her character is kidnapped, she's at least not Anastasia from 50 Shades. Anastasia from 50 Shades is often portrayed as someone who has a mental disability, or at least someone who is much younger mentally than she is chronologically. Having read the first 50 Shades book, her character comes across like she's 12 years old. At least the character of Laura is a little bit different. So, where the movie's a little bit better in the story-wise is that at least Christian Grey he's just a CEO of like a tech company or something, or a mutual fund. We don't really know what Grey's Enterprises Holdings, or whatever his company's called, does. We just know he's rich and he works in Seattle. And he owns this big multinational company. but we don't quite know. We never find out what exactly he does. But at least him being abusive, I mean, not that CEOs aren't abusive. CEOs, I think there was a thing that a larger percentage of CEOs are psychopaths than the general population. But him being the way he is makes a little bit less sense in that world than this world, where the character of Massimo, he's a violent gangster, he's killed people, though the only person you see him kill in the movie is someone who is selling children into sex slavery. So the movie does want you to still be like, oh, he's violent, but he's a good violence, just so you're not completely off his side. So at least the movie does that. But at least him coming from this violent crime world at least makes it a bit more sense that he has this weird pathology than Christian Grey, who is just sort of like abused as a child and then kind of becomes this weird misogynist thing. But when Laura's kidnapped, first of all, there's this weird thing about Laura having like a heart condition. It's mentioned once, and then it comes up again when she's first kidnapped because he gave her a sedative to make her pass out in order to kidnap her. Love story. But aside from that, the movie doesn't really do much with it. But she's definitely more headstrong. So her reaction to getting kidnapped isn't to be like, oh, okay, I'll just go along with it. Like perhaps if Anastasia was kidnapped in the 50 Shades movies. Laura's reaction is a little bit to fight back. She grabs a gun at one point. She tries to escape, but then she finds out that in public in Sicily, the cops all know who Massimo is, and the cops are owned. So she can't really escape by using the legal authorities. But then she spends a lot of the movie just kind of teasing him, or in a less eloquent term, like rape baiting him, where she's like testing him. Because the ground rules that Massimo sets up when he kidnaps her is that he wants her to end up liking him. Like, he doesn't want to force himself on her, he wants her to have Stockholm Syndrome and fall in love with him. Love story. So she, like, teases him by, like, showering in front of him and, like, coming up close to him when she's trying on underwear and he walks in the dressing room without her permission. And that kind of thing. And, but Massimo, while he at least doesn't go full-on rape in the movie, he does, like, choke her out a lot. Like, he doesn't, like, hit her, like, smack her, but he does, like, put his hand around her neck in a forceful manner and push her up against a wall a lot. So it's still very violent, aggressive shit. But I guess because it's, like, a choke and not a hit or whatever, since choking can happen in consensual sex, the movie's still trying to skew you to not hate the guy. So the filmmakers are somewhat aware of what they're doing. And so they're trying to push it a little bit beyond what's acceptable, but not so beyond that it escapes, I guess, normal rough sex fetish stuff? I don't know. I assume that's what they're doing. It's like, what is the maximal level of problematic we can do and still hang on to our core audience of people who like trashy romance novels and trashy erotica? And this movie definitely finds that line better than 50 Shades ever did. But he does that, and he gropes her a few times, and there's a scene where he has her, like, tied up to a bed, and he's, like, touching her thighs and her breasts and everything, and it's still rapey. The movie doesn't really want you to think he's crossing lines, but he's still breaking his own rules here. So, there's that. So, the first half of the movie is essentially this. It's essentially Laura under Massimo's kidnapping, and he takes her out to different events or whatever, and in public and in private, Laura's sort of, like, teasing him as revenge because she can't quite escape. I mean, she does have access to a phone at one point, so I guess if she was really trying to escape, she could call Interpol or something, even if the local Sicilian cops aren't doing anything, but she doesn't, and she seems to want to, like, play along to sort of do this. I mean, I'm not sure what her ultimate goal is, because either she's going to really frustrate him and he's going to let her go, which I think is her goal, or she's going to really frustrate him and he's going to go full-on sex criminal. But whatever, that's the tactic. At least she's taking a more forward tactic. She's not as passive a character as Anastasia is in 50 Shades. So, I mean, there's that. But the first half of the movie is essentially just that. And then it culminates into the centerpiece of the movie, which takes place on a boat, where they sort of, like, have a fight because she dressed in like a provocative outfit at a club, and another guy hit on her, and so Massimo may or may not have killed the guy. And so there's a bit of a struggle on a boat. She falls off the boat. The movie wants us to believe that she was in danger of drowning, even though she later just goes for a swim in this very same water. Um, and so she knows how to swim. Just because she got pushed onto a boat doesn't mean. I mean, it's not choppy water or anything. It's just it's like flat blue, like sandals vacation resort water. So, but whatever. So she, in her mind, when Massimo jumps in and saves her, it's saving her, and so suddenly she's in love with him, and then they have a very lengthy montage sex sequence on a boat where it's multiple positions on multiple parts of the boat. Now, the first thing I could think of on the scene on the boat is that prior to their fight on the bow of the boat, one of Massimo's employees is also on this boat. And it's not docked, it's on the water. So is his employee just trying to run around the boat to make sure he's not in the same room they're fucking in? Or did he like did he just swim to shore? What happened to him? But whatever. So a lot of talk has been about the sex scenes in this movie, and I think that's because if this were an American movie, it would have gotten an NC-17, simply because the ratings board in the U.S., the MPAA, or I think they changed it to the MPA now, but the ratings board used to be called CARA, C-A-R-A. They're not big on certain thrusting and shots lasting too long and that sort of stuff, so the thrusting and stuff alone would make this an NC-17. So I think a lot of American audiences aren't used to sex scenes in a movie looking like this, whereas people who watch more international films, I mean, they might remember Blue is the Warmest Color, which had that like 7 or 8 minute long lesbian sex sequence. That movie got an NC-17 in the US, by the way. So they might remember that, or if you've seen other international films with sex scenes, Lust, Caution... that's the Ang Lee movie, right? Yeah. Stuff like that. Sex scenes in movies outside of the U.S. are often more explicit unless they come from a very religious country. Like movies in Central and South America sometimes aren't as much, or Southeast Asia. But anywhere throughout Europe and stuff, they're a bit more lenient with sex as opposed to being less lenient with violence than the U.S. is. Kind of shows where the U.S.'s priorities are, but regardless. So a lot of people have been like, oh, are they really having sex? No, I don't think so. So... I'm pretty sure the actor playing Massimo is wearing a merkin during it, and it's just because of the fact that you see more variety and shots for longer. It's fooling people, but it doesn't seem that. But there's also scenes in the movie where Massimo is really into, like, face fucking. There's no other way to put that. Face fucking. And, kind of non-consensual. There's a scene early in the movie where they're on Massimo's private jet, and he finds out that someone has stolen some coke from him. And so his way of coping with this is to go into the back of the private jet, pull a curtain, and then take the flight attendant and kind of sort of force her to perform oral sex on him. And during all of the oral sex, there's like 3 in the movie, I think. You can kind of see what looks like a penis in the woman's mouth, and I'm pretty sure they used like a dildo for those scenes. By the way, every woman in this movie immediately dabs her lips after the blowjob scene, and they do the whole like mascara crying thing, and it's... yeah, so still more explicit than you'd see in an American movie, and probably on most of what's on Netflix. But because it's more than that, people are thinking... like, I remember... the movie in the 70s, Don't Look Now, I have the Criterion of it, with, what's his name? Donald Sutherland. People used to think that sex scene was unsimulated, but for the most part, the United States Actors Guild, SAG, won't allow actors to have actual sex in a movie. There's exceptions to that. Chloe Sevigny in The Brown Bunny and some other ones you can point to. But some foreign films don't do that as much. Stuff by like Lars von Trier or Gaspar Noé. There's other directors who have made movies that have unsimulated sex, but they're not pornographic films, or at least they're not aimed at being pornographic films. They're aimed at being traditional narrative films that happen to have explicit sex. This isn't one of them. So then we have the second half of the movie, and the second half of the movie. You can definitely tell it's the second half because the actress dyes her hair blonde and gets a haircut. But also during this second half, Laura is suddenly in love with Massimo. And it's basically become 50 Shades darker and freed, where Anastasia's okay with being with Christian type of thing. They kind of just cut that meat off at the halfway point of the movie. And then at that point, you start to get into more plot stuff that you don't really necessarily need if this wasn't going to be a series of books and movies. But because it is, you get stuff with like Massimo's ex and like a rival crime family and all that kind of stuff. So the second half is less interesting than the first plot-wise, because at least the first half has this sort of basic romance novel problematic dynamic, and then the second half just wants you to believe that Laura's suddenly okay being in love with the guy who kidnapped her. Though, to the film's credit, there are parts of the movie where the movie is sort of still pointing out that this is the situation. Like, 50 Shades always seemed like it did not realize how bad it was, or how bad the situation was. And I think that's because the author of those books, E.L. James, did not realize that. Because, obviously, 50 Shades was originally fan fiction of Twilight. Twilight also had a very problematic romance that the fan base didn't care about and the author didn't realize. Probably because the author comes from a religious background that's very patriarchal and misogynist. So 50 Shades always seemed oblivious. I don't know. No, I don't want to say that the directors and the actors were aware of that, but obviously the author of those original works was oblivious to how problematic or just didn't care. And then the screenplays to the second and third movie were written by the husband of the author of the books. So those movies completely were oblivious. This movie at least pays lip service to what it knows is wrong with it, where Laura has it's either a best friend or her sister, I can't really tell what it is, but her name is Olga. And Olga, they have conversations where she's like, oh, I got kidnapped and I fell in love, and then Olga's like, you're in a prison, you're in a gold prison, but it's a prison nonetheless, and like you're still trapped in your mind. They never say the word Stockholm Syndrome, but it's still very clear there. But, spoilers, I guess, Laura ends up pregnant, and she wants to be with Massimo and keep the baby, so that's possibly all part of her own brainwashing as well. And then the movie sort of ends in an anticlimactic fashion where they drive into a Princess Di tunnel, and then it's assumed that she's killed. So I looked into it. I don't know if the novels have been translated into English, so I don't know if they're available in American bookstores or American Amazon or whatever. But I know that Laura's not dead, she's kidnapped by a rival crime family. And they were going to film the second movie of the series, but then COVID obviously shut down all of the movie stuff, so productions, so they couldn't film it. So one assumes that now that this film, because this film was released in theaters in Poland, I assume it had a theatrical release in other countries, but obviously COVID shut down theaters in many countries, if not all of them, for a while. So I don't know how many countries saw this in theaters, and I don't know how many have just discovered it through different foreign Netflixes. It'd be funny to watch this in an Alamo Drafthouse Rowdy screening, certainly, but yeah, so I don't know. I'm not sure if it was a big box office success, but it's certainly become a streaming success with people talking about it, so I assume they shouldn't have any problem funding or filming the two sequels, unless they make a second movie that combines the second and third book. And I've sort of read what the basic plots of those books are, and I don't know, maybe they'll be okay movies. So, I just want to say, that, from a filmmaking standpoint, this movie is miles better than any of the 350 Shades movies, for the simple fact that these movies are very nice to look at. The cinematographer, the director of photography on this movie, they use different colored lights. They put different light fixtures that have like different cutouts on them to create like interesting patterns on the walls. There's beautiful aerial shots of like Italy and a bunch of different exotic locales. It's a very good looking movie. So as far as just pure pictures on a screen, these movies look great. 50 Shades obviously takes place in the Pacific Northwest, so everything's very sterile. It always looks like it's been raining. Everything is very Patrick Bateman-esque. This movie, it's rich and alive with a lot of different colors. It's a very pretty movie. If nothing else, it's a very good movie to look at. There's not too many interesting like directorial like shot things like zooms or pans or dollies or anything, but from a visual standpoint, it's a nice looking movie. The actors at least fit the roles that they're playing. So you can criticize some of the dialogue delivery, but I assume English is not either of the actors' first languages. So, like, for instance, none of the Italian characters can say the name Laura as Laura. They'll say, like, Laura, or they'll stretch it out a little bit. So they have problems with that. So, and I can't remember, I think there was one line of dialogue that Laura delivers that, though the syntax wasn't correct, she, like, switched the order of two English words, but otherwise, that's fine. So the movie is mostly in English, but there's a few subtitled parts where Italians are speaking to Italians or Polish are speaking to Polish. But otherwise, yeah, it's the acting's fine. The sex scenes, so I will say this, the 50 Shades movies were always a bit odd in that it was clear that the audience for those movies were mostly women. So you'd think that if it's a movie for women, most of the nudity and the sex would be aimed at showing the male actor and his abs and his ass and all that stuff. But the 50 Shades movies focused way more on Dakota Johnson's naked body than they ever did on Janie Dornan. So in this movie, it feels like at least the film knows the audience it's aiming for. So the actor who plays Massimo, he has plenty of ass shots. They show his chest many, many times. You see his dick a little bit in a couple scenes. So you're clearly, if you want to see the hunky actor naked, you're getting your goods. The female actress who plays Laura, she's also naked a lot too, but the film doesn't seem to dwell on her. Like, if she's naked in a scene, it's usually before she falls in love with him, it's meant to show her in some sort of vulnerable state. So changing and backed up, or tied to a bed and a robe slightly exposed, or she's teasing him in a shower type of thing. And then during the sex scenes, it's mostly just because she would be naked in the sex scene. But the camera still, you get a lot more shots of Massimo's face, you get a lot more shots of his torso during the sex stuff. It's the director, and I think one or both of the directors are female. At least one of the directors is. It was Barbara something. They know who the audience is, so they know who that audience wants to focus on. And I think I had read somewhere that when they do sexual films like this, where the audience is straight women instead of straight men, they will usually pick a female actress who isn't very busty or isn't very curvy or whatever, so that the female audience doesn't feel as intimidated. So I think in that sense, this actress was also cast for that reason. Whereas a man who is short and skinny and pale is going to see Massimo and be like, well, he kind of looks like an ugly drowned rat, but I can also see why people who would find him attractive. So, fine. But yeah, the movie delivers the goods for its target audience, and the sex scenes, because the sex scenes in the 50 Shades movies, they're very montagey, there's a lot of quick cutting, and they don't last very long. Now, the sex scenes here are also montagey, but they don't cut quite as fast, and they do last for a longer amount of time. So I imagine the people who are just watching it for those scenes, or the people who just want those scenes to be a bit more meaty of the movie, they're getting their goods. So at least this movie knows what it's supposed to do as a member of its genre than the 50 Shades films, which seem to think they were a romance first and erotica second. And I think this movie at least knows it is more erotica than it is romance. So the self-awareness of the filmmakers involved is more appreciated. Plus the fact that it's just a better shot and well-made film. The music choices are not as good as at least 50 Shades. As horrible as those movies are, they at least have a decent soundtrack on all of them. There's a handful of songs in this movie that got stuck in my head in 365. But some of them they just seem like generic American music that you weren't able to get a recording contract for, so you leased it to this movie. But I think all of the songs have English lyrics, and they all seem to be American. But, yeah. So, as far as the movie, would I call it a good movie? No. Despite the filmmaking prowess involved, and despite the fact that it knows what it is, and it's catering to its audience in a decent way, it's still not a good movie. The plot is still, at the end of the day, it's still about a man who is violent kidnapping a woman under the guise that she will end up falling in love with him through proximity. It's you cannot take that premise and turn it into a healthy romance. You just can't. So if you toss that aside, if you're just looking for trashy erotica that is well filmed, you got that. It is trashy erotica, and it's a well-made movie. That's all I can really say in the positive. If I were to give it a letter grade, C plus, I guess. It's I did not find the movie morally reprehensible like some parts of 50 Shades. It's not laughably bad at any points, really. It knows what it is. The first half is probably more entertaining than the second half because it tries to deal with its problematic premise in a somewhat realistic way. Like the character of Laura at least behaves the way you expect her to kind of behave in that scenario before the Stockholm twist at the halfway point. So, so the first half is more entertaining than the second half for that, but it's all right. Yeah, you can do worse. There are many, many worse films. The 50 Shades one's obviously. That movie Bound, which was the Asylum ripoff of 50 Shades. Any number of erotic thrillers from the 80s and 90s that no one remembers, and even some that people do that were written by like Joe Esterhaus and stuff. It's a better movie than Showgirls, I guess. Not as fun a movie as Showgirls, but a better movie. So, if you have Netflix, go ahead. I mean, if you've heard about this movie and you're interested to see it for yourself, sure. It is at the end of the day the best compliment I can give it, aside from the fact that it is legitimately well shot. It is a good looking movie. Is that it is much better than 50 Shades. And considering I'm pretty sure that the Polish author of the books was attempting to rip off 50 Shades, or at least do a 50 Shades adjacent type trilogy for herself, the fact that it at least owns what it is, and at least does what it's doing better than those films and books did what they did, yeah. So, there you go.